Health IQ Podcast. More than a diagnosis, the truth about trauma and its aftermath.
Today we have a very interesting topic about an approach to care. Welcome back to Health IQ Podcast. I am Brenda Bishop, your host, and my crew today is Bobby Hockaday and Joyce Runyon. And our special guest traveled all the way over from Albuquerque, Liam Westgate. Thank you for coming. Liam is currently serves as the Director of Community and Clinical Linkages at Presbyterian Healthcare Services in New Mexico. Our local hospital is part of their system. And Liam is a licensed social worker and has, his bio, very extensive professional experience. He even still teaches above working his full-time job. And his professional work is about caring for the whole person, which I thought was really, really interesting. And he's done some extensive work on trauma and trauma-informed care. So that's our topic for today. So I thought we would start with just saying what trauma is.
That is a really good question. I could give you two different kinds of answers. The nerdy one or like the super simple, accessible one. So I think I'm going to go with this. I think I'm going to go with that. So the definition of trauma that I really, really like is really a short phrase. It's too much, too fast, too soon.
Too much,
too much,
fast, too soon.
Exactly. Too much, meaning that you're overwhelmed by an event, right? And we can talk about different kinds of trauma and that kind of thing. So you're overwhelmed by an event. It all sometimes happens too fast, right? There's certain aspects of trauma. Actually, one thing that I find super, super interesting in studying this for so many years is trauma can disrupt a person's sense of time. So if you think about flashbacks, a lot of times when folks learn about like post-traumatic stress disorder and those kinds of things, that idea of time traveling, right? So too much of something, too fast. And when we say too soon, the truth is no one's ready for trauma, right?
Right.
So I like that phrase, too much, too fast, too soon. And the other part about trauma that I think is really another maybe hopefully accessible way to think about that is that a traumatic event, right? And there are two other types of trauma we talk about. Big T trauma, right? So maybe if somebody was a combat veteran, right? That's often the big T trauma. When we think about there's another kind of trauma, little T trauma, right? Maybe it's been a series of events, right? If you've been going through a traumatic medical experience for many, many years, right? Mm-hmm. Those are not to say they're lesser traumas, but it happens more and more over time versus a singular event. But all that together, when we think about defining trauma, think about it also as it hijacks your normal, right?
Yes.
So after something traumatic happens, you're changed, right? It doesn't mean that healing can't happen. It doesn't mean recovery can't happen or treatment can't happen. But when we talk about trauma, the person that you were when you, there's a very famous writer, I think about Haruki Murakami. He's a Japanese writer, and he talks about this idea of when you go through the storm, you're not the same person after, right? So that when we get into studying trauma, there's a lot of this rich imagery sometimes that I find a little bit more relatable versus let me diagnose you, let me do that. But it's a significant event that really leaves a person changed.
Wow. Well, I can think of so many different ways that trauma shows up in a person's life. Mm-hmm. So several years ago, the Health Council was working in the area of intimate partner violence, which was also a new area for me. And we were contacted by someone needing trauma-informed care. Mm-hmm. And I had never heard of that. Yeah. So I, called around and found several providers who said yes and sent those to that person. Yeah. But I think that's another definition we need to talk about.
Yeah. Well, first, I really want to normalize that even though the phrase trauma-informed care, I've been training about trauma, let's say, with one organization when I was still in Baltimore for about almost 9 years. And even though trauma-informed care has been around since always, but especially it started gaining traction in the late 90s, it hasn't gone everywhere, right? But when we talk about trauma-informed care, there's a lot of different ways we can think about that. One is that at its most fundamental level, and I'm thinking about from the community perspective, it's a lot of language changing, right? So one of the common phrases we talk about in trauma-informed care is, instead of saying what's wrong, what happened, right? So if you have had a traumatic event happen to you, you didn't cause it, right? So when we talk about trauma-informed approaches, it could be different language. It could also be thinking about some of the different, there's another thing in trauma-informed care called the core principles of trauma-informed care. I'm not going to go through all 6, but one of the most important themes that comes up in that space is, how do I promote safety and choice, right? So we know that a lot of times when somebody's had a traumatic event, that they didn't choose it. They didn't consent for it, right? So trauma-informed care, as an example, might be about really, really promoting consent and choice and transparency, right? I'm not going to make anything mysterious during our helping relationship. But that idea of like full trust and transparency, and also just making space for, there are sometimes bigger picture forces in our life, right? You mentioned intimate partner violence. There's a lot of layers to that experience. So, I think those would be some like really important things. But the last part about trauma-informed care is that if you're a trauma-informed provider, you're always super conscious about this idea of do no harm, right? We talk, probably a lot of folks have heard of that phrase, do no harm. But if I'm cognizant of what you're carrying, then I'm also going to be super, super intentional to like not add to that, right? So as a helping professional, that's something that becomes like a really important point, right? If anything, I should be hopefully taking something off your shoulders and making you feel a little bit of relief, versus doing anything that could make you feel like you're having that experience again.
So we were talking about providers, and they receive training and hopefully this and as part of their social work, or their I guess you start as a social worker to become a mental health provider, right?
For many, social workers are one of the different forms. But, I think especially in the last, I would estimate, especially in the last 10 years, I've seen more of the adding trauma-informed care to curriculum, right? But in truth, once people kind of graduate, and the only difference between school and like your job is a day, you know what I mean? But once people start to get into the field, it's like, if you don't have that as part of your training, you really feel that, right? Because you mentioned at the start of this, like whole person care, you can't really get there if you're not thinking about, something outside of what's that one thing that you're supposed to be treating.
So then when you're going back to that whole person care, we probably should, talk about that a little bit too. I don't know if our mental health providers do that, but I know that some of them have like CareLink programs and things like that would help. And one's doing a program called WRAP. So maybe talk a little bit about what those whole care systems are.
Yeah, I think whole person care as an idea is really important when you talk about trauma-informed care. One of the least helpful things you can do when someone is experiencing, either actively or in the past has had any kind of trauma, is like fragment their care. And what that means is going too many different places, right? One of the ways that I mentioned a moment ago, trauma can show up as a sense of disruption in time, but it can also show up in terms of like being able to trust folks, right? That shows up for a lot of good reasons, right? Because someone's experienced an event that has created a precedent that it's not safe to trust or be open and those kinds of things. So programs like WRAP and whole person care type initiatives where people can go to a place and get more than one service is really, really helpful. another thing that's really, really helpful about those programs, and it's an art, right, to build the right team, right? So I feel like that's also something to normalize. A patient's not going to necessarily have the same relationship with everybody in the team, right? That's normal, right? Maybe I like you a little bit more than the other. That's okay. But when you have those team approaches to working with folks, one of the most important things that it does is it reduces the number of times somebody has to tell their story, right? That's like not what somebody who's gone through a big life-altering event wants to do. So that team, we can, maybe one person hears that story and helps to share what's necessary with other team members so that person who's receiving the care can focus on what they need and not sort of be re-traumatized when they're doing all those kinds of things.
Wow, that makes a lot of sense.
I'm glad. I hope so. Yeah.
So I think probably the most important thing that we need to talk, we talked about that trauma-informed care and that people are being trained, and now we have it in most communities. But as we look past that, is how can the community support a person who has trauma?
Well, that's a really good question. I think from a community perspective, it's helpful to know a few things about folks. And this is not to speak for everybody who's at a traumatic event, right? But there's a couple of key things that we often see that if we didn't have like that insight, we can really misunderstand that. So maybe I'll describe like a couple common features, right? One thing that comes up a lot for folks that I've, worked with trauma and also teaching around this is we mentioned the sense of time. Tracking things sometimes can be really hard. So if you are connecting with someone and you're like, why aren't they paying attention? It may not actually be that. It may be that this person has been through something that makes it hard for them to focus, to remember, to recall, right? So making a little bit of space for like, what's the story underneath, right? Another thing that comes up a lot for folks who experience trauma is something called, I'll give you the nerdy term and then unpack what it is, but lowering somebody's distress tolerance. So what that can look like is somebody who we perceive as going from like 0 to 100, like they're really reacting to something. And we're like, wow, you really feel like you went to a level 100 and this was like a 2, right? Sometimes that reactivity can be something that comes from a place of trauma, right? So just understanding that part. If you are in the community and maybe you're serving other folks, one thing that the last thing that I would mention that's really hard for folks with trauma is waiting. I've worked in a lot of clinics where, waiting in a line or waiting in a waiting room. I mean, that's literally what the title of the room is. But sitting for long periods of time and waiting and feeling anxious in that space is really hard. So if you are a service provider or a helper, maybe helping your loved one to schedule a time when maybe the waiting room is a little less busy, or going to them to the pharmacy where they might have to like interact a lot of things. Navigating systems is really, really hard. I think, the last thing that's really important to just emphasize so that we're not just looking at vulnerabilities, right? But the one thing that's really kept me in studying trauma-informed care for a very long time now is this idea that story can also change, right? So the other thing that I think we need to know is that people can go through really hard things, and it doesn't always mean that they're going to have PTSD. It doesn't always mean that it's going to be a locked-in outcome, right? So there's a lot of space for movement and recovery and healing. And so when we talk about trauma-informed care, when we train clinicians, sometimes we say, aspire to be curious, right? Aspire to be curious about what's behind the story versus like judging on face value, right? So if you see something that maybe your loved one or your friend or community member is experiencing, being curious and being gentle, because I think a lot of us have probably heard that phrase, right? That we don't often know what's happening inside somebody, right? So those are some like really basic things. There's a much longer list, but I think those are the things that often show up like in the day-to-day interactions.
Well, I think whether if someone's gone through a traumatic thing and experiencing PTSD, we as humans we don't know what anybody's going through in their day, or how bad their day might have been, or how their day started off. So we should always be thinking in terms of that as we communicate with others and be on our best behavior probably as well.
Yeah.
So earlier you were talking about that sometimes people who've gone through trauma lose their what was their signals or we didn't mention it here, but we were talking before that.
I think before we were starting today, we were talking about again sort of how sometimes people may see a behavior but may not know the story, but there's a lot of different folks that write and study about trauma. I'm just going to kind of give you the cliff notes a little bit, things that I found to be particularly helpful, one of which is that if somebody had to survive, let's say, a really serious or traumatic event, in order to do that, they have to sort of train themselves to ignore their red flags and their warning signals, right? Because, one of the things that I do deeply believe about anybody that's been through a traumatic event is they're experts on survival, right? But when you get out of survival mode, living the day-to-day life is hard, right? So I think another thing, sometimes we might, observe or see folks and we're like, is that a pattern? Why is that happening? But, just like trauma can disrupt a person's sense of time, it can also lock you in a loop, right? But that business of part of what we work on a lot in trauma recovery models and treatment programs is helping somebody to have a new relationship with themselves, right? To have a new relationship in the sense that you're an expert survivor. And your instincts kept you alive, right? And now how do we kind of really help you to have a different kind of relationship with yourself, which takes time. I mean, honestly, that's the work all of us are doing, right?
We're all trying to improve ourselves.
Exactly.
And as you mentioned PTSD, it automatically made me think of support animals and those kinds of things. Are there other kinds of coping things? I know the animal part, but...
Yeah. I mean, support animals and, when we talk about like not just emotional support animals, but like therapy dogs and those kinds of things, there's a lot of, it's really interesting. I worked in a previous role where I actually did a good bit of studying, for instance, about like service members and relationships with, their, dogs and that kind of thing. So I think that's one thing that a lot of folks might see. Another type of therapy that a lot of folks might receive, depending on the level of trauma or the type of trauma, might be, different kinds of long-term therapy. Sometimes we talk about like EMDR, which is really a complex intervention that has a lot of things to do with helping somebody to create a relationship with their body, with themselves, and those kinds of things. I also don't want to discount the part that there's also a lot of folks that go to therapy, and I encourage that if that's right for folks. There's a lot of folks that go to support groups, right? Sometimes hearing somebody else who's had a particular experience and knowing that you're not alone, you can sometimes mix and match different types of modes of intervention. And there's also some folks that do, their process at their own pace, right? And that could be anything from, connection with faith-based communities. Sometimes that could be helpful. That could be connection with physical exercise, right? I would say personally, and I'm not going to speak for every helping professional, but you have to find something that works for you and makes sense, right? As something that gives you a sense of safety and gives you also a sense of there's a place beyond the moment that you have felt really like trapped in for a long time, right? So anything that gives you hope and anything that gives you a stronger connection to yourself and community, those are different factors that a helping professional will often explore with somebody.
But above all, you need to feel safe.
You got to feel safe. Yes.
And
you
whatever
gotta
it
feel
is
safe.
you're doing or wherever it is you're
Yeah.
living or
You got to find safe. The hardest part, honestly, that when you work with folks who are in sort of that long-term journey is also making space for normal, right? Like normal life. Like, what do I do after a crisis?
right.
Right? How do I thrive? How do I live? That's actually sometimes the second hardest part, right? So whenever helping professionals are working with folks, or if folks are doing that at their own pace, to really make space for like a little bit of normal and a little bit of joy, right? To sort of counter maybe what your previous story might have been.
Okay. So as a community member, we would want to hopefully be safe and not threatening to them and encouraging.
Encouraging, definitely. There's a lot of things. Sometimes even maybe you're a community member and you're like, I'm not a mental health professional. I run a small business, right? You could even think as fundamentally as how do you set up how you welcome people, right? It could be something as really fundamental as those kinds of pieces. How do I make sure that I'm leading my social interactions with compassion and not judgment? Right.
Compassion.
How do I don't know if folks have experienced this too, asking questions with genuine curiosity. When we say, how are you doing? How are you doing? Right. And making time for that answer. Right. You may not, through those interactions, open up a big thing, but you're creating these little tiny precedents each day that, there are good and kind people out there that are there to give you the benefit of the doubt. And so I don't want to be like super Pollyanna and like be like big things happen, so you just got to smile and be nice. It's all of these things together. But the more that, we in community can create a sense of welcoming and, promotion of recovery and healing and optimism, those little things, I've talked to so many clients over the years, and it's not always the big events. It's like, I was at the store, I was having the worst day, and then I saw Brenda and she was just really kind, and people clock those things and they register those things. So it's the little things that can also really, really matter to folks too. Okay.
I think that's a great place to end our discussion today, so that we all remember that to be kind. That has been our theme for the last few years, to make our community kinder. And so we want to thank you first of all for coming. And we have another gift.
I like my accessories. Thank you so much. Thank you.
And that's a little cell phone holder.
Thank you so much. It's very cool.
With, of course, our Health IQ logo on it.
That's right.
And we invite you all to come back next time as we have another great topic to raise your health IQ.
Special thanks to our guest, Liam Westgate, Director of Community and Clinical Linkages, Presbyterian Healthcare Services, New Mexico, and our host, Brenda Bishop, Quay County Health Council Coordinator.
Podcast crew, Director, Robert S. Hockaday. Producers, Robert S. Hockaday, Joyce Runyon. Camera Operator, Robert F. Hockaday. Second Assistant Operator, Joyce Runyon. Editors, Joyce Runyon. Music provided by David Morris. Funding for this podcast is provided by New Mexico Legislative Appropriation from Representative Jack Chatfield. Brought to you by Quay County Health Council. Follow us on YouTube, Facebook, and Instagram at Quay County Health. If you have content ideas, reach out to us at healthiqpodcast@gmail.com.
This podcast was created solely for educational and entertainment purposes. It is not intended as a substitute for advice from a healthcare or mental health professional.